WNYC Studios is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. We'll begin today with some excerpts from and your reactions to the debate we co-hosted with NY1 last night in the Democratic primary to succeed Congressman Gerald Nadler in New York's 12th congressional district. That's the district covering Manhattan from around 14th Street up through the Upper East and West Sides. WNYC senior political reporter Brigid Bergin and Errol Lewis from Spectrum News NY1 and I were the moderators. Brigid will join me in just a minute. There were 5 candidates on stage competing for this highly coveted seat, and some of the things they went round about were really interesting and major issues in our world. 2 members of the State Assembly, Alex Borges, who represents the East Side, and Michael Lasher from the West Side. That's enough right there for some of you geographically to make up your minds. Nina Schwalbe, a global public health expert who has held senior positions at the UN and USAID. Also the anti-Trump political commentator and former attorney George Conway, and Jack Schlossberg, social media commentator and grandson of President John F. Kennedy. Among the things they disagreed on, as we'll hear, were military aid to Israel, a moratorium on data centers, whether Chuck Schumer should resign as head of the Democratic Party in the Senate, and more. Hey, Brigid, happy morning after.
Good morning, Brian.
And listeners in the district, you'll get first priority on the phones to say anything you learned from the debate last night. 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. Call or text. And first priority will go to voters in the district who, let's say, went in undecided last night. Let's try not to make it surrogates for each of the candidates, calling in. The candidates will speak for themselves in these clips. And listeners in all these competitive primary districts, we will have a straight who are you voting for series of call-ins on these competitive races coming up in a few days. But for today, what did you learn watching or listening to last night's debate or from the excerpts we're about to play, especially if you had not made up your mind going in? And any questions for Brigid, who's covering the race and doing analysis, of course, always welcome at 212-433 WNYC. Call or text 212-433-9692. The first excerpt is a section I moderated on the topic of climate with a very specific angle, and then a quick follow-up where I was surprised by the outcome, as you will hear. An increasing source of fossil fuel consumption, as you all know, is the massive growth of data centers to support artificial intelligence systems. I'll note that the 2 state lawmakers who are with us tonight did not vote this month on a proposed 1-year state moratorium on data centers. You had a good excuse. You were all at the first debate, or you were both at the first debate. But do you support it? Governor Hochul has to decide whether to sign that bill. And would you support that at the federal level as well, a 1-year moratorium on large data centers, Mr. Lasher?
I absolutely would support a federal moratorium on data centers. And there is a subtle but important difference when it comes to the state moratorium that was just passed. I was the very first co-sponsor of state legislation to impose a moratorium on data center construction in New York. And Alex, voters should know, signed on to that bill the day it was slated to pass.
Mr. Boris.
I don't know if that timeline is true, but the bill was also introduced like the day it passed.
No, that was the final version of the bill. The original version of the bill had been pending for months, Alex.
Yes.
And you never co-sponsored it, and you only came out for a moratorium on data centers at the last possible minute when it was a fait accompli, because Anthropic certainly does not want a moratorium on data centers in this country.
That's the first true thing you've said on this. Anthropic doesn't want that bill, and I co-sponsored it and argued for it. You're absolutely right. I do support at the federal level a bill that would flip the incentives here, because right now the incentives we put out for data centers are to do the absolute dirtiest version, what Elon Musk is doing in Tennessee, spinning up gas turbines. But if we actually set the rules of the road that you have to bring your own energy, that it has to be renewable, that you have to connect to the grid and pay for those upgrades and pay a fee on top of that, we could actually end up with a grid that is more reliable and more green. But it requires actual regulations that will get us there, and I'll fight for those in Congress.
All right, let's get the rest of you on whether you would support a one-year federal moratorium on big data centers. You're not in the New York State legislature, so you can't have an official position about Governor Hochul. But Mr. Conway.
I think as a short-term measure, yes, but I think at the end of the day, I don't believe in moratoriums because I don't believe in shutting down business or progress. I think what we have to do is figure out a way to make more energy, make maybe regulations like what Alex has just talked about making sure that data centers bring their own energy and use renewable energy. We have to increase the supply. Well, as with so many other things, we have to increase the supply to bring the cost down, and we have to increase the supply to match the demand. And, data centers do serve a useful purpose. We all store information in the cloud. But we have to pay. We have to figure out how to pay for it. We have to make sure that energy prices don't go up for regular people. And we have to figure out more ways to make renewable energy, none of which I would say is going to happen as long as we have a president who thinks that windmills cause cancer.
Thank you, Mr. Schlossberg.
I'm only for a moratorium if there are regulations attached at the end of solving the problem. A moratorium for a moratorium's sake doesn't make any sense to me. I want guarantees. I want guarantees that new data centers are going to have to bring their own energy, and it's going to have to be green energy, that they're not going to be able to draw off the grid and drive up utility prices for everyday Americans. And I just want to note that, Alex, are talking about Anthropic's policies and their preference. I hope the FEC is watching, because there is not supposed to be coordination between super PACs and their candidates.
And Ms. Schwalbe.
Yes, I would support the moratorium. And I think the deeper issue here at the federal level is that we need more clean energy. Mr. Trump has decimated the Environmental Agency, basically got rid of it, close to like USAID. We need to reinvest in renewables, stop investing in fossil fuels, rejoin the Paris Agreement for climate. It's not only big picture climate that is a problem for our city, it's also little picture. And what I mean by that is air quality, asthma. We have some of the highest rates of asthma in our NYCHA housing of any place in the world. So we have a lot to do. I think the congestion pricing was a brilliant idea to bring down the traffic. So again, we've got proposals for bus lanes that can also be subsidized by the federal government, bicycle lanes, a lot of things to turn us into a greener city and enact the Green New Deal. Thank you.
As a quick follow-up for everybody else, I originally had this as a lightning round question, but do you support congestion pricing as Ms. Schwalbe does, Mr. Schlossberg?
Absolutely, 100%.
I do, and I'm very proud to be endorsed by the League of Conservation Voters in this race because of my strong and consistent record on environmental issues.
Mr. Conway?
I support congestion pricing. I think it was a great idea, and it's working.
Ms. Boris?
Absolutely. Congestion pricing has led to more pedestrian traffic, less vehicle traffic, less emissions, and funding for our subway, which is the lifeblood of New York City.
All right, all of that, about a 5-minute excerpt from last night's debate. Climate and congestion pricing came up there at the end among the 5 candidates running to succeed Gerald Nadler in Manhattan's 12th congressional district. Our senior political reporter and co-moderator from last night, Brigid Bergin, is with us. Brigid, so to that ending, I was a little surprised they all agreed on congestion pricing because part of the district is in the congestion pricing zone, but lots of voters in the district north of 60th Street are not. Any thought about why they may have found unanimity on that?
I think there's probably a sense that, the impact of the actual policy on the district, for those who may have been concerned that it was going to increase parking in certain areas, they're probably not seeing some of that. And, if the traffic's moving a little bit better, I think that people who are regular drivers in that area are probably pleased with that as well.
I think it's one of those policies that a lot of people have basically adjusted to and absorbed. And so to be generating that revenue without necessarily feeling pain from it, I can see why those candidates are probably not hearing it as a top concern from voters, which is most likely the biggest reason why no one was saying they opposed it.
And on the moratorium for data centers, there was some nuance in the panel on that. I would say Michael Lehrer and Nina Schwalbe took the most unequivocal position. Yes, Governor Hochul should sign, and there should be a federal one-year moratorium on large-scale data centers. But Boris was less enthusiastic. Conway basically said, no, we all have a lot of stuff in the cloud, and so we need data centers. We just need to find a way to generate that much energy. And Schlossberg said it only makes sense if we have something as a larger energy policy and climate policy for the end of a one-year moratorium, which I guess is a yes. But what did you make of the range on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating, Brian, to be listening back with you this morning, having sat through the debate and having heard the answers once, to really be zeroing in on what they're saying. And when I listened to it this morning, to me, what I heard was Conway essentially, to my ear, vamping on the answer that Boris gave with some nuance, agreeing that, yes, a moratorium, temporarily, but doesn't really believe in moratoriums, and that ultimately there should be federal regulation related to the energy production, and that their new data centers should be relying on green energy. However, ultimately, the only way to regulate the market is for there to be more of these data centers. So not a long-term moratorium in, the policy view of George Conway. On the flip side of that, hearing Schlossberg talk about it and saying there's no reason to have a moratorium without guarantees, to me, sort of, it was the sign of a first-time candidate and didn't, recognize the challenge of actually legislating. That part of what a moratorium might be about is giving yourself the time to achieve some of those other goals. And so, I don't think anyone is arguing a moratorium for purely a moratorium's sake. I think what these lawmakers are trying to contend with is that this is really a new frontier of technology, and they are just beginning to figure out how to regulate it. And so a pause gives them an opportunity to come up with some of those regulations.
Yeah, and just if we could digress from the congressional primary for a second and put on your New York issues senior political reporter hat.
Sure.
The legislature did pass this one-year moratorium on big data center construction in Albany, but it seems like Governor Hochul has not decided whether to sign it or not. Do you know if she's ambivalent? What's the politics there?
I think that is one of those bills we will be watching very closely. And, if I had to guess, Brian, it would be one of those December bills where, when we're busy with the holidays, the governor makes a decision, and if it's a good decision, we hear a little bit more about it sooner. And if it's, potentially vetoing something like that, it's something we hear maybe, certainly post-election, post-November.
Incredible that she can sit on it for 6 months. This also leads us to what most viewers might have found to be the most contentious aspect of this debate. It was sort of implied or briefly suggested in those clips about data centers. And that is between Assemblymember Lehrer and Assemblymember Boris about who is beholden or not to companies in the AI industry. Here's a very short soundbite clip of each. Michael Lehrer first.
I chose public service. You chose Palantir.
And Alex Boras.
I know what actually happens inside these companies, and that's what terrifies them.
So what's this all about?
So here you have two members of the Assembly who are both relatively new members of the Assembly, but who had very different career paths to start. Alex Boras is a computer scientist. He worked at Palantir. He left Palantir and, with a certain whistleblower kind of aura to him. Palantir, of course, was one of the large data companies that did work for ICE. And one of the charges that Lehrer will lay at his feet is that he was part of, be part of the company that helped ICE mine for lots of data. Lehrer, on the other side, has been working in public capacities. He was an aide to Mayor Mike Bloomberg. He's been an aide to Congressman Nadler, to Governor Hochul, and throughout his career, has been working essentially in politics, in public service, and is accusing Boris of having made this choice to take a different path that was likely more profitable. Boris's response is that one of the reasons voters should consider him is that he does understand these technology companies, and that when he realized some of the things that he thought they were doing incorrectly, that he walked away and, left those career opportunities and that financial fortune on the table.
And here's a caller, David in Stuyvesant Town, who I think keyed on that aspect of the debate last night, that Boris and Lehrer were going against each other over and over again. They kept coming back to it on who's beholden to anybody in the tech industry and to the PACs, super PACs that represent any aspect of this. So, David in Stuytown, you're on WNYC with Brigid Bergin. Hi.
Hello. That was sort of the subject that got me thinking, but what I really want to know is, I respect the debate moderators so much, because you guys know a lot of facts. I know that from just being a New York news consumer. And so I know you probably can't or won't say this on the air, but I want to know, who did you guys find to be the most honest or dishonest, especially in light of what you guys know that a layperson might not? And that particular thing where they're accusing each other or defending themselves from accusations from the other, because those things don't get resolved on the stage for
right.
It's a
very fair question and a very good question. So, Brigid, based on your reporting, what can you say is real there?
Well, I mean, David, what we can tell you is there is an unbelievable amount of money being poured into this district by outside super PACs that are trying to influence it. There's about $10.5 million that has been pledged by a super PAC that is opposing Alex Boris. There's another $8 or so million from some other super PACs that also have ties. I should note that $10.5 million is from a super PAC that has ties to artificial intelligence that opposes Boris. There's another $8.5 or so million with also ties to super PACs that is supporting Alex Boris. Michael Lehrer has about, upwards of $5 million from a super PAC that is being funded by former Mayor Mike Bloomberg. So there's a lot to untangle there. I think if you read in, the tech landscape, there is something of a proxy war being waged here between these different tech companies. It is absolutely true that Alex Boris worked for Palantir. It is absolutely true that Alex Boris left Palantir and then entered public service. It is absolutely true that Michael Lehrer worked for Mike Bloomberg and Kathy Hochul and Jerry Nadler and has been working in public service. Whether that means any of these candidates will feel beholden to the interests that support them, that's a tough call to make before they've been elected. But these are all good facts to have when you make your decision about, which candidate you believe is the one you want representing you.
Yeah, and maybe this is where we should mention some of the endorsements. The outgoing Congressman Jerry Nadler and also Mike Bloomberg, who's put millions into the Lehrer campaign. Correct me if that's wrong. I see $7 million. And any others in what you might call the Democratic establishment in the state, all behind Michael Lehrer. So Nadler and Bloomberg. Governor Hochul also? Is that accurate?
Yep, Governor Hochul was behind Michael Lehrer. And I'll double check to make sure that we're not missing any big names here. But Alex Boris has picked up a lot of union support. He's got support from the teachers, DC 37, RW, DSU. I will say, looking at some of Michael Ash's endorsements, he has, I think what people would think about folks who have ties to the Upper West Side, and that, is going to be a really interesting part of the race. Another lens you could apply to it is, thinking all the way back to 2022 when you saw this district redrawn and the East and West sides combined so that we had two incumbents running against each other in the primary out again with Michael Asher representing the West Side and Alex Boris representing the East Side. Alex Boris also endorsed by former Representative Carolyn Maloney, along with some of those unions, Our Revolution.
That's Bernie Sanders,
exactly,
Our Revolution in Boris.
And so, a really interesting, different set of constituents that have aligned themselves with these candidates. It will be very interesting which one is able to turn out votes. We tend to see lower turnout in these June congressional primaries, but we're coming off of a primary season, a year ago and an election last year where so many voters were energized. And in a race like this, where you have 8 candidates on the ballot, no ranked choice voting, people who are connecting with voters in so many different ways, as influencers, as cable news mainstays, as, up-and-comers with, a completely different backgrounds. I think that this, the turnout in this district is going to be sliced and diced in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and among these 5 candidates, and like you say, no ranked choice voting, somebody could theoretically win with 22%. So we'll see how it turns out. And of course, in this very Democratic district, the nomination really is the election. You mentioned the Bernie Sanders, Our Revolution endorsement for Boris. One footnote, Mayor Mamdani, who has made news by endorsing in some of the other congressional primaries in the city, has not endorsed in this race, even though he votes in this district. So he's going to presumably, unless he stays home, which is hard to imagine, Mayor Mamdani is going to vote for one of these candidates, but he won't say who. Do you know why not?
It's an interesting question, Brian, and he has been asked, who are you endorsing? Will you endorse? Notably, there is no candidate who's affiliated with the Democratic Socialists of America in this particular race, and most
no
of his
explicit
endorsements,
DSA candidate here.
Exactly. And so most of his endorsements are candidates who are affiliated with the New York City DSA, so that, may be part of it.
All right.
I think, also these candidates, their positions don't fit as neatly under the kind of DSA positions as some of the other races that may also be another part of it. Could he change his mind and weigh in last minute? Stranger things have happened.
Or say, after he casts his ballot as to who he voted for. I guess we'll find out eventually. Well, here's a section of the debate moderated by Brigid about redistricting. You all know that both red and blue states are trying to redraw congressional district lines to favor their parties, but it's not as simple as a pure partisan issue, as you will hear in Brigid's question.
The national mid-decade redistricting wars have landed in New York. The state legislature passed a constitutional amendment last week that would allow the state to redraw congressional lines before the next census. The amendment would need to pass the legislature again next year and then go before voters in November of 2027. But several voting rights groups have come out against the current amendment. Latino Justice Pro-Def, the Asian American Legal Defense Fund, and the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College. They say the amendment strips critical civil rights protections from voters of color and makes other unnecessary and sweeping changes to New York's redistricting framework. So by a show of hands, who supports the current redistricting amendment? That would be Mr. Boris, Mr. Conway, Mr. Lasher.
Good job translating for the radio audience there, Brigid, as to who raised their hands for the visual. So, maybe the most interesting thing there was your question, which kind of revealed some nuance in progressive interest groups in the state on whether the state should do this ultra-partisan redistricting in favor of the Democrats. And maybe you can explain a little bit more about that and then tell us why that particular split of 3-4 and 2 against.
Well, so the reason we were asking the question, of course, is because since President Trump sort of encouraged the state of Texas to begin their to do mid-decade redistricting, we've seen this redistricting war across the country of states trying to increase the number of seats to reflect, their party in power's preference for seeking control of the House of Representatives. Under New York's state constitution, we are not able to do mid-decade redistricting. We're supposed to do it after the census. And there was an attempt based on a lawsuit in New York 11, which is that Staten Island, South Brooklyn congressional seat, that they were trying to redraw that district based on saying that voters of color there were unable to elect a representative of their preference. That legal challenge went up through New York state courts, but ultimately the Republican challengers sought intervention from the U.S. Supreme Court that issued a stay preventing the lower court's ruling that that district be redrawn be implemented. So with that background, the state legislature at the same time here in New York, which is, of course, a Democratic majority, were looking for ways to make sure that New York was not stuck on the sidelines. Democrats argue you need to fight fire with fire. So they put forth a proposal for a constitutional amendment that would allow for mid-decade redistricting. As we've talked on this show before, Brian, constitutional amendments are not a quick, easy solution in New York. You need to pass 2 successive state legislative sessions, and then voters have to weigh in. So the soonest this could be adopted would be November of 2027. But there are some, among what would normally be Democrat-allied voting rights groups, concerns that this new proposal would just essentially move the process too quickly, and that communities of color, particularly Black voters, could see their districts diluted and could potentially lose representative power. And so they have raised some concerns about this amendment. It's kind of a fascinating conversation that is far from over, because now that this amendment has passed the legislature this session, it will have to pass again next session, so next year. And I suspect there'll be a lot more conversation about the potential risks as we see, changes happening in other states, and, other states seeing some of their district lines diluted, states that are losing what have been historically Black majority representatives potentially losing those seats. And so I think there will be some concern from these voting rights groups about what the potential impact could be in New York, particularly if somehow the Democrats were not in charge.
Here's a listener question that I think you can answer because you moderated a segment on this. Listener asks, are any of these candidates supporting a clear rent freeze? So hold your fire there, Brigid, because we're going to play a 3-minute stretch from the debate that you moderated on almost exactly this, affordability generally, but you'll hear how much housing dominates, Lehrer, then Borres, then Schlossberg.
When I rented my first apartment in New York City, I unwittingly rented it from one of the worst landlords in the city, a guy named Steve Croman, and I had to sue him to get our security deposit back. Fast forward 20-odd years, and just this year I worked with District Attorney Bragg to pass legislation to make it easier to prosecute landlords for tenant harassment. And voters should know that on the issue of housing, there is a difference between Mr. Borres and myself. On the most significant piece of pro-tenant legislation to come before the legislature since he's been in the Assembly to prevent landlords from taking rent-stabilized units off the market and combining them into mega luxury units, he voted with the real estate lobby and the Republicans against that bill. I'm running on a new deal for a new generation. to offer every young person a guaranteed first job, help getting their first apartment, whether they're trying to buy it or rent it, and assistance getting through the first year of parenting without getting crushed by the costs. First job, first home, first year. Those are the kinds of ideas I think the Democratic Party needs to get back to.
Mr. Borges, we'll go next to you. We'll give you an extra 15 seconds to respond to Mr. Lashler's bill.
These are the games that New Yorkers are tired of. There was a technical problem with that bill that made owners responsible for their entire history that Micah himself spotted and the governor spotted, and they revised the bill. And when the revised one came back, I voted for it. But the governor also vetoed the other tenant protection bill that was there that day. So we should just be straight with voters about what's happening. But I will agree that the biggest cause of affordability challenges is housing. We need to build more housing, and we need to preserve the affordable housing that we have. This is personal for me. My wife and I are raising our first child, a 9-month-old, and we're so lucky to be able to do that in the neighborhood where I grew up, where my parents were able to raise us on 2 union salaries, an impossibility for many New Yorkers today. So the federal government should be expanding the help that it is giving to cities and states. The bonds that it already gives to New York, where we use our cap, we should be able to use unused bonds from other states. We should also get rid of the Fair Cloth Amendment to fund public housing. We need to have a champion of cities in the seat who will fight for every dollar for housing so that every New Yorker can continue to live in peace and economic security.
Mr. Schlossberg.
There's so much that the federal government can do about this problem. I'm the only one up here standing with real plans to help New Yorkers immediately. My standard renter's deduction could save New Yorkers 1 month of rent per year. Deduct your rent from your taxes. Simple idea. I've also got a plan to make Donald Trump pay the cost that New York City taxpayers are currently paying for the perimeter around Trump Tower, which costs New Yorkers hundreds of millions of dollars a year. I want to invest that money. I want to make him invest that money in cops, teachers, and transit. I want to make HIV medication free at the point of care. I want to increase the child tax credit. I want to make it easier for nurses to become nurses and send them to elder care facilities, assisted rehab centers, and those centers that take care of the elderly, because we have to take care of our elderly population here in New York.
So that excerpt from last night's NY-12 debate on NY1 and WNYC, moderated by Errol Lewis from NY1, Brigid Bergin from WNYC and Gothamist and me. That was a Brigid-moderated segment among these 5 candidates. And Brigid, let's go to the last thing, pretty much the last thing we heard there. Jack Schlossberg, who had maybe the most specific housing-oriented proposal, renter's tax deduction. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a proposal that he has talked about on the campaign trail, and it's one of the ways he said the question was, what would be your top priority to address the affordability concerns of constituents in your district? And the top proposal among many of them included many proposals. But for Jack Schlossberg, he came out of the gate with this idea that for the sake of fairness and given how many renters there are in the district, that a federal policy that would allow you to deduct what you pay in rent from your taxes would be a way to put money back in the pockets of constituents. I think a proposal like that is likely easier said than done. But it is an interesting idea. And it is something that, voters can concretely consider as opposed to sometimes policies that are a bit more sprawling.
And it's not a new idea. The notion is that, hey, homeowners get a tax deduction on their mortgage interest. So why shouldn't renters, who in general have less income than homeowners and therefore could use a tax deduction more, out of a sense of equity, why shouldn't they get a tax deduction on their rent? As you say, easier said than done in terms of enacting it, especially as federal policy that would cover the whole country. But it is an idea that's been out there, and Schlossberg is choosing to raise it to the foreground by embracing it for the campaign. All right, we'll continue in a minute with excerpts from and your reactions to our 12th congressional district primary debate last night with the 5 Democrats vying to succeed Congressman Gerald Nadler. We'll hear them on military aid to Israel and more coming up, and we will reveal which of these 5 candidates who was not all that well known before last night, seemed to have won the hearts of a good number of you who are calling and texting in. So stay with us for that. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we continue with excerpts from and your reactions to our 12th congressional district primary debate last night, with the 5 leading Democrats vying to succeed Congressman Gerald Nadler for that district in Manhattan from about 14th Street up through the Upper East Side and Upper West Side. Again, the members, the 5 who were there, 2 members of the State Assembly, Alex Borres and Michael Lasher, also Nina Schwalbe, a global public health expert who has held senior positions at the UN and USAID, the anti-Trump political commentator and former attorney George Conway, and Jack Schlossberg, social media commentator and grandson of President John F. Kennedy. Next excerpt, here's a question I asked about a hot-button topic in the Democratic Party generally right now, as you all know, and certainly in the various New York Democratic primaries. It's about military aid to Israel. We'll note that this is the most heavily Jewish district in the city. Around 30% of expected primary voters is the number I've seen. But it's also worth noting, as most of you know, that Jews themselves are increasingly divided on Israel, and the candidates were diverse on where they come down in this 3-minute excerpt. There's a bill in the House called the Block the Bombs Act. Politico describes it as requiring Israel's government to establish in writing the use of offensive weapons in accordance with U.S. and international law, and it must be approved by Congress, unquote. Now, Congressman Nadler has declined to support this measure, but the House Progressive Caucus as a group does support it. Nadler is in the House Progressive Caucus but does not support the bill. If you're elected and the Block the Bombs Act comes to the floor, would you vote for it or against it? Ms. Schwalbe first.
I absolutely support the Block the Bombs Act. I support a free Palestine and a democratic Jewish state of Israel, but U.S. tax dollars should not be paying for genocide. I do not support the Iron Dome being paid for it. This is maybe where I differ from Jack. I think Israel can pay for its own defense systems. Thank you.
Mr. Schlossberg.
The U.S.-Israel military relationship is of the utmost importance. Israel is our historic ally. I do hope for a better future between our two countries. As of today, I would vote to stop sending offensive weapons to Israel and vote for the Block the Bombs Act. And I think that this is a moral question that is being put to our country right now. At the same time, because, and for the same reasons that I want to protect civilian lives, I do support continued funding for the Iron Dome. It protects civilians, including 600,000 Americans who live in Israel. And I think the United States' goal should be peace in the region and to protect civilian lives as best we can.
Since it expanded to those two things, let's stay on those as we go down the row. Mr. Lasher, either of those?
I believe deeply in the future of the Israelis and the Palestinians to be one of peace and ultimately a place where there can be self-determination for both peoples. Like Congressman Nadler, I don't think that those measures would meaningfully improve the conditions of people's lives there. I would reintroduce his legislation to enact sanctions on West Bank settlement, expansion, and violence, and push for robust enforcement of the Leahy laws, which subject all of our foreign assistance to examination that is used consistent with our values and human rights.
So that's no on Block the Bombs, as well as you would continue to support Iron Dome funding?
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Conway.
I oppose Block the Bombs. I strongly support Israel, although I don't support some of the conduct of the Gaza war, and I'm certainly not a particular fan of Bibi Netanyahu. That being said, we have to look at our relationship with Israel on a long-term basis, and we have to work with Israel as, frankly, still the only democracy in the Middle East, imperfect as it may be, imperfect as our democracy may be. And we cannot abandon Israel and deprive it of its ability to defend itself, and I don't think the distinction between offensive and defensive weapons is really a meaningful and enforceable one.
Thank you. Mr. Borres.
I agree with Congressman Nadler on block the bombs, on the Iron Dome, and on sanctioning the West Bank settlers who are committing violence. All of those are positions that I hold. I've also spoken about how we need to not just enforce our Leahy laws, but strengthen them. We should be applying universal standards to all of our aid and our military sales. We should have much more transparency as to the reports that happen, insulate it from the political process so civil servants make that determination. And I've put forward many specific proposals to do just that.
Just to be clear, when you say you agree with Congressman Nadler, that means you
that I would do not support block the bombs. I would support Iron Dome funding. I would support sanctioning West Bank settler violence. And additionally, I would like to strengthen our Leahy laws.
Thank you all very much for your responses in this round. All right, Brigid, interesting. Nina Schwalbe was the most anti-aid because she said no what's considered defensive aid generally, like for the Iron Dome defense, missile defense system. In addition to supporting the Block the Bombs Act, nobody else went that far on the stage, but there was definitely a range.
Absolutely, and this is an issue, that it has taken up, large portions of many of the candidate forums in this district. So, this is not something that the candidates would be surprised to be asked, in part because of, the constituents in this district, as you described. But absolutely a range. I was really glad, Brian, that you pushed Mr. Borres to be a little bit more explicit about his position and not just say that he shared the same position as Congressman Nadler, which, for a voter who isn't familiar with the positions that Nadler holds on that particular issue, might have been kind of a way to signal to that voter something without actually saying something. So I think that clarification that he supports the so-called defensive Iron Dome funding, sanctioning the West Bank settlers, and strengthening Leahy laws was an important clarification there. But definitely, if you had to put them on a continuum, Nina Schwalbe's position puts her far to the left of this particular pack.
And she's the only one who uses the word genocide. George Conway seemed to be the most on the right. And maybe that's not surprising
Sure.
Because, and he made his statement included that it's a false distinction between offensive and defensive weapons. And I guess he considers them, I'm reading into it, but I would take away from it that he considers them all defensive if Israel is going to be consistently under attack.
Right.
So let's talk about Conway for a minute. He's pretty open about really running on one thing, the need to impeach Donald Trump again. But he's got a conservative background to some degree before this, right?
Yeah, I mean, former Republican, obviously former husband of Trump advisor Kellyanne Conway. He is explicit that he is running for this office for a single term, just 2 years, with the purpose of impeaching President Trump again, and basically will take any question you ask him and use it as a way to get to that point. So even when we asked him about housing and affordability, he started by talking about needing to end the tariffs, but then ended in a place saying none of these policies would be possible with the current president in office, and therefore our first priority needs to be impeaching President Trump for a third time and removing him from office. I think our colleague on the stage, Errol Lewis, asked an important question, which is, if you are in a position where you've been elected and Democrats have to choose between impeachment or some of these affordability issues that voters have said are really their driving concerns, which direction do you go? The answers there were also very interesting, right, Brian? You had candidates who said, like Alex Borres, who said, I think we can walk and chew gum. We need to be able to, pursue charges against the president as well as pursue these affordability policies. And then someone like Conway, who makes it his number one priority, leading, candidate Nina Schwalbe to ask, okay, Mr. Conway, if we do that, which she believes can also be done, what's your day two plan? What do you want to do after you impeach him? And that's where some of his arguments get pretty thin.
And let's talk about Schwalbe, because she had a number of notable moments. There was that one we just played in the context of the military aid to Israel question. She made a point of saying she would oppose Chuck Schumer remaining the head of the Democratic Party in the Senate, and asked everybody else to raise their hands if they agreed with that, and nobody did. Yeah. Her main background is in public health. And at one point, she criticized others for their expensive campaign mailers and said the money could be used to vaccinate people. And I thought that was very indicative of who she is. And now the reveal that I teased before the break about who seems to have changed more minds of at least people calling and texting us this morning after watching or listening to the debate last night. And I will say we have a significant number of people saying, hey, I didn't know about this Nina Schwalbe, but now I'm for her, and I'm going to let Nancy on the Upper West Side represent the group. Nancy, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling in today.
Thank you, Brian. Can you hear me?
Yes, we got you.
Great. Thank you, Brian and Brigid, for doing that debate. It was extremely helpful. I was one of those people. Nina Schwalbe was a complete unknown to me, and I felt she was head and shoulders above the four others. She's not backed by wealthy donors or huge PACs. I guess that's why I never heard of her. I started with the thought of pox on both your houses for Boris and Lehrer because of all those awful negative flyers that we are getting in our mailboxes every day. And so I loved her comment about the you can use the money. Some of those dollars can go to vaccinating kids and other wonderful health issues that we have now. I felt she was clearly intelligent, very intelligent. Her involvement in global affairs would be helpful in the Congress. Her field of healthcare is so important. And just, I think, to extract from that, her ability to administrate based on what she said. I went to her website right afterwards and read all her stuff. I felt she was crystal clear in her views. None of the waffling or giving the safe answers that I've heard so often that drive me crazy. And she's down to earth, and she has a fun sense of humor. I know she barely has a chance. I'm not the only one who never heard of her. But it may be a wasted vote, but at least I feel I can be proud of it. And so I thank you for this debate.
And I thank you for your call. And obviously acknowledging who's on the caller board and in our text thread is not an endorsement of Nina Schwalbe, but just to say that there are a significant number of people, just telling you what it is, who are texting and calling in with very similar thoughts to Nancy. So here is Schwalbe making a point last night of the fact that she was the only woman against four guys running to succeed Jerry Nadler. This actually begins with Alex Borres saying something friendly to George Conway.
No, George, it's been lovely having these engagements. I mean it. Okay. I think we're going to get a beer after this. The
bro moment, bro call out.
You're invited to the beer, Nina. Don't. Beer is not gendered.
So, Brigid, we can do a separate segment on whether beer is gendered, but Schwalbe certainly made her point about the mostly male pipeline, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Brian, when I started covering this race, in the spring, I was trying to kind of get my head wrapped around it, and I called a source in the district who's, very familiar with the lay of the land there, and that particular individual is a Lehrer supporter, but said to me, I got to say, I've been going to these forums, and this Nina Schwalbe, she's really interesting. She's on my radar. And so I started doing some reporting in the district. I went to one of the candidate forums at the Stephen Wise Reform Synagogue on the Upper West Side. And all the same five candidates who were on the debate stage were all supposed to be there. But at the last minute, Alex Borres had a conflict. So it was just Michael Lehrer, George Conway, Jack Schlossberg, and Nina Schwalbe. And it was an interesting conversation having her there. She kind of at that point, the New York Magazine story about this race had recently run. And for those who don't remember, there was a cover story written by a really great journalist, David Friedlander, and it was a great story. But the cover featured the 4 men who have been kind of dominating the coverage of this race. Everyone who was on our stage, minus Nina. And I was just curious to see what kind of reaction she was getting among voters. So I went out to do some reporting, watching her kind of stump and make her pitch to voters. And very interesting, the kind of same conversation or the same perspective we just heard from that caller, Nancy, was what a lot of voters that's how they were responding to her. And so, the challenge of being a first-time candidate in a district that is as wealthy and well-organized as the 12th congressional district means you are climbing the equivalent of Mount Everest to be able to break through the political noise. But I think for those who have encountered her and who are looking for something that's different, she is making an interesting and positive impression.
And obviously, based on the military aid to Israel clip, she may go too far for some voters in the district,
Absolutely.
too, and be turning people off. But, just acknowledging in the informal, unofficial, thoroughly unscientific sample of people writing in and calling in to say who changed their minds last night. There aren't a lot of people calling and texting, and I repeat, informal, unofficial, thoroughly unscientific sample of anything, but there aren't nearly as many people calling or texting to say, oh, I got more persuaded to any of the other 4 candidates. But I want to put a little bit of a spotlight before you go, Brigid, on Jack Schlossberg. What people know is he's a grandson of President John F. Kennedy, the only grandson of President John F. Kennedy, and a social media influencer. Here he is addressing Michael Lasher on that fact.
You have repeatedly called me a TikTok star, as if that is a bad thing.
And on his legacy, as he made, by the way, as if TikTok influencer is a bad thing, he came out with an explicit generational appeal to voters, saying he represents younger Democrats, but also this about his family heritage.
I'm on this stage in my own right as my own man. I am Jack Schlossberg. I run a campaign all across this city with more plans than anybody else on this stage. I have made my way here myself.
So a thought about Schlossberg in this race, and then we're out of time, Brigid.
Sure. I mean, the other part of that response from him, Brian, as you remember, was Michael Lasher had essentially invoked the legacy of the Kennedys and said that was part of what had inspired his career in public service. And I think he was trying to, in more subtle ways, distinguish his decades of work in public service from Jack Schlossberg's relatively new entrance as being the young man that he is into public service. And, part of what Schlossberg was trying to do there was to say, don't invoke my name or my family's name and tell me about public service. I understand public service. I'm here on my own, but, he was very critical of Lasher for doing that in that moment. I think we saw from Jack Schlossberg, from what I have seen on the campaign trail, a steadier version of him. He did offer some interesting ideas. You also saw that this is a novice candidate who has to talk about some of his ideas as opposed to some of his accomplishments, which is a distinction from, the fact that he's running against some of these candidates who are significantly older than he is. But he does make the point that he has been able to appeal to a younger set of voters. It's unclear if that appeal is to a younger set of voters who live in this district that will be able to vote, or if it is appealing to younger voters more broadly across the city. But I think there is something positive to be said for the idea of trying to continue to engage new generations in the political process. Brian, you and I have talked so many times about the challenge with turning out voters, engaging people in this process. And so, If one of the ways that candidates will engage them is through TikTok and through Instagram and connecting on the platforms where they spend their time, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But when you try to then go deeper into what those policies are really about, that's when sometimes things can get a little thin.
WNYC senior political reporter Brigid Bergin, who co-moderated last night's debate with me and Errol Lewis, political anchor for Spectrum News New York 1. Brigid, thanks for your work on the debate, which was great. First time we shared a debate stage last night. That was awesome. And thanks for your analysis this morning. And we're actually going to play one more little clip of something that you brought up at the debate, and they're fun responses in this respect coming right up. But Brigid, thanks for coming on the show. We'll see you at the water cooler.
See you, Brian. Thanks so much.